panel and the unenviable task of being the time manager now. So I have to break up your lovely break conversations and ask to turn your attention forward for just a second so we can get started with the next panel of the morning. Continuing the conversation around changing boundaries of ethnicity in Africa from enslavement to freedom. This is a lovely opportunity for me because I get to introduce the person in the room who I have known the longest and the person in the room that I have most recently met. I will introduce first Ned, let him talk, and then introduce Andrew, who many of you have already met. And a personal note, this week marks the 20th anniversary of my knowing Ned.
Oh, really?
The first week of fall quarter.
The first week of fall quarter. What's that? Now it's 1 week higher.
Yeah, no.
What's fall quarter?
As many of you know, this is our first week on campus. We are just starting back. UCLA runs on the same calendar, and it was 20 years ago this week that I started grad school under Ned's supervision, in great part. Since his first book, Ned, Ivory Enslaved in 1975, Ned Alpers' work has asked us to think about African connections with the wider world. So he was doing that clearly before it was fashionable. And his work has continued to discuss the emergence, or foundation to discussing the emergence of a coherent sense of Indian Ocean studies. His robust publication record now spans 4 decades and shows no signs of abating. It's picked up since his retirement last year, in fact. And any of you want details of that very long and rich publication record can look up Ned's impressive CV for a complete list of titles. But what I want to flag for you are the number of recent publications that are collaborations, which include Resisting Bondage in the Indian Ocean with Gwen Campbell and Michael Salmon, and Cross Currents and Community Networks encapsulating the history of the Indian Ocean world. In part because that shows what doesn't show up on Ned's CV, his commitment to collaboration, to fostering conversation, to putting people in conversation with each other, both for his own students and with anyone else who managed to cross his path, who had curiosity, a keen mind, and a willingness to engage. And with that, I turn it over to Ned, eager to hear what he has to say.
So am I. Always a surprise. Well, this is, I feel like I should begin with a line from Monty Python. See, now for something completely different. A, it's not Atlantic. And then this paper comes about 8 years ago. I was working in the conference, actually another collaboration with Benita Zimba and Alan Isaacman at the conference that Benita really organized on slave routes and oral tradition in Mozambique. So I spent some time working in the Archivo Histórico de Mozambique, looking for one set of things, and in the process discovered a reference to this liberated slave register. And I took some notes then, because I'd never seen anything like it. And when Alex contacted me about this conference, I thought, well, here's a perfect chance to utilize this. So I contacted Alan, and he put me in contact with one of his graduate students who's been working in Mozambique for the last 2 years, who put me in contact with a young Mozambican who's working on an MA at the Centro de Estudos Africanos at Edward Milan University. And the end result is that he had photographed and sent to me in digitized form the registry. It's not as high quality as the things that you've been looking at here. It's got all the problems of legibility, multiple hands, all that, crummy 19th century paper and acidic ink, all of those kinds of things. But somebody's gonna have to go look at it again in their flesh to make sure that everything is there. But what this is it's a register of liberated Africans, and it's a different meaning than, that we've been talking about these terms. And liberated African means something quite specific. It's not being manumitted, it's not emancipation. And in the Portuguese context, it has nothing to do with coming off a slave ship. What this is a registry of people who were enslaved, in this case, in northern Mozambique, the area called the Ilhas de Cariba Island, Cabo Delgado Ilhas. The Cape Delgado was the border between Mozambique and Tanzania. But the islands, the Kariba Islands, go south from them down to the Loria River, basically, to Pemba. And this was, so if you think about Mozambique, there's Mozambique Island and its hinterland, which they didn't have any control over whatsoever. There's the Zambezi area, which Alan Isaacman and Mal Lewitt and other people have written about, which we know quite a bit about, the famous Process to Corolla. There's the south, which was the late, first Sofala, and then eventually Lorenzo Marx Maputo, which is very late in the day. And then the Kariba Islands. And they're an interesting area. It's an area that was very much an outlier, where people probably spoke as much Kiswahili or Kimwani as they spoke Portuguese. There were Prozers there, actually, which have been very little studied. Some of the biggest ones, the descendants of a Dominican priest, controlled many. It was very much like the Zambezi. And in the 19th century, when you come to try and understand where this register fits in, and here, let me get this right. This is a kind of, I've added names of places that appear in this registry to a map that's actually from ivory and slaves. Gives you a sense of the stretch of these things from let me make sure I've got, from top to bottom. Actually, I would have to get in front to do this. And then to show you just a better, these are some modern maps. This is a big tourist area now, so lots of people going, beautiful beaches and everything. But what I want to show is that it's an area where there's a very convoluted coastline and many, many, many little islands in addition to the ones that are the larger ones. And so it was, in the 19th century, a major area for slave trading across the Mozambique Channel. And it was an area where there was an official Portuguese presence, but that presence was always, I think, very loosely under the control of Mozambique. So it was an area like Zambezi, not quite as rebellious, because eventually, if you know anything about Mozambican history, when the Portuguese really started to conquer what becomes modern Mozambique, one of the biggest areas of resistance was the Zambezi Valley. And so this area was sort of domesticated in that sense, but it was very much outside of things. Now, liberated, the whole status of libertos, as they're called in the Portuguese context, is really a transition between slavery and forced labor. And just to quote Jim, and to remind people that if you haven't ever read Jim Duffy's A Question of Slavery, it's still a very important book. He says, this was written published in 1956, so slavery became free labor, contract labor, forced labor, and the slave became a worker, but a traditional relationship was unchanged. And that's really what this is about. This is this odd period where you've got a short time of libertos, and before the Niassa Company comes into play in northern Mozambique at the beginning of the very end of the 19th century, 1899, 1902, and then moves into what becomes forced labor, cotton, and all kinds of other things. So, in looking at this in a Portuguese context, most of the literature about this is about Angola, typically. And the literature that is about Mozambique tends to focus not on libertos or anything, but basically on forced labor and migrant labor going to South Africa. So there's these, you think, well, there's a lot that's been written on a place like Mozambique, but it's very, very peculiar. It's like there's all this stuff on the liberation struggle in the north, but nothing on the 19th century. So there's huge pockets. And the other thing, of course, then to understand about the Portuguese is that they were latecomers to abolition. They owned both the slave trade and then slavery. They only reluctantly got away with it because, as Duffy pointed out more than half a century ago, their colonies depended on slave labor. So there's a series of royal decrees and regulations from 1854 on that basically define the end of slavery. The bottom line is that by the 29th of April, 1878, everybody who had been a slave was supposed to be free, was supposed to be liberated. But like liberated Africans in the Atlantic sense, or the British sense, there were terms of labor that were connected to that. So you get liberated, but you were supposed to still work. And so what this registry does is to over a period from 1860 to 1875, so that is just after the 1854, the first regulations for abolition, and just before the end of this period of Libertus, it's registering all of these people. So that is sensitive. Let me see if can I go backwards on this? Oh, no, how do I go backwards?
Just use the arrow key.
This is when, you feel, oh, no, I want to go back to the top. The other way. See, that's the, okay, so it's that one. Okay, all right, so here's the registry appears in the AHM, and it's got a cover page with modern writing. I don't know who did this, but what was nice, of course, is it told me, without having to do the counting myself, that how many men and how many women were registered in it. So that was nice, and that part of the work was done. And this is all very preliminary, and it gives the old codex number, and this is what the actual registry itself looks like underneath. And then what's interesting is they had a form, like all those British, we were talking about this a little bit yesterday, they had a form, and you could say it says province, distrito, and then you fill in the district, conselho de, and it's a registro, and so it's a registry for pretty much anything you wanted. Slaves, in this case, libertus, and then it, according to the decree of December 1854, so it became in this regulation that it had. So, to understand this, I've been using as background a peculiar Portuguese thesis. It was done in Lisbon by a guy who'd been a colonial official there. Guy's now in his 80s somewhere, which I found online on a website that doesn't exist anymore, but fortunately I printed the whole thing out, page by page, 350 pages, 8 years ago. So that's all I've used. I actually haven't seen the original in Lisbon. But the interesting thing is that one of the things this man talks about, Carlos Bento, is the Portuguese did it's called a Relação Geral dos Habitantes das Ilhas e Povoações e Terras Firmes dos Seus Distritos. It's basically a census. And he's used it in his work, which studies the Caribe Islands from 1777 to 1822, which is when during the period of the Malagasy raids, to establish how many people were there, what the free population was, what the slave population was, and some breakdown, because I wanted to see if there was a baseline that I could compare this registry against. One of the things that was supposed to happen with these regulations the Portuguese passed, you were supposed to register slaves. And there are some of these, but not for the Caribe Islands. And the other thing is that the former foreign minister, José Corvo, talks about one for Mozambique, by which I think he means the Ilha and the mainland areas, where he registers some 40,000, and then he says, when it came to Libertus, there are about 4,000. So something weird has happened between the 40,000 a few years before the Libertus. But we have no baseline, so have been using this, and I'll show you some numbers in a minute. But the registry itself, which I want to point out here, if you take a look at it, let me get it, since I both turned it on and have it with me. So it's got number and order of senores, the masters. They're not owners, and they're numbered right all the way through. And then the names of the senores and their place of residence. Almost all of them are at Evo, which is the name. And then it's got the names of, in this case, every handwritten page, Libertus. And it's got their sex, and so you get a listing of the men and women with their names. And then you have, this is an interesting word, which is, and I was interested to see, it's not nação, it's naturalidade. So naturalidade, about the last definition of this word in Portuguese is nation. But it's interesting that they chose naturalidade, I think, because in some ways it says, well, they're not really, it's not really a nation, they're sort of natural people. I mean, it's got that sense to it, and it's not a word, I mean, I don't think it's a word that you would use normally. for nation. But that's clearly what it is. It's not ethnicity either. And then, and I love this, we were talking about age. Idad provável. So it says they know that they're not being exact. And one of the interesting things is that most of the people are between, they're either children or they're between 14 and 40. I mean, they're using the old slave categories for this. And then they have sinhais. And unfortunately, instead of giving nice things like cicatrizzations, where I could tell from what I know about this in Mozambique, it'll say reddish color, oscuro, it's basically nothing. Normal, whatever that means. And officios, which I haven't really had a chance to read because the handwriting is so bad. And then finally, observations. So I'm going to say something about some of this stuff and then observations until Laura tells me to stop. So one of the things I want to, I'm actually going to go to first right. This is the population of the Carimba Islands, Cape Delgado Carimba Islands area in 1798. So you see that there were a total of 8,900 people were counted as being sort of in Portuguese realm. Free, which means free sort of Portuguese. Free Adimu is really interesting. Bento argues that Adimu was from the Swahili word Hadimu, the indigenous population of Zanzibar called Wahadimu. It's clearly, so that presumably meaning free but not Portuguese. Of some sort of, but not necessarily Afro-Portuguese either. I mean, this is the problem with all of these things. And then slave, and then totem. So that's what I have as a baseline. Okay, I'll come back to that. So when you start looking at the number of libertos, there's all kinds of interesting things that come out of this. There are this is one way of looking at it. Number of libertos registered per master. It turns out that when you go back to this database that I'm only using from Bentu's stuff, there was about a quarter of all the enslaved population were held by two of these big prazu holders. And some of them, and then their cobblers, they're kind of the heads of things, were all had African names, clearly African names. And the largest numbers were, one person had 800 slaves, so there were very big numbers. When you get down to this is the number of libertos registered per master. It's an odd way of thinking about it. But what's interesting is that you can see how it's over 80% are responsible for fewer than 5 libertos. And it goes up, and there were only 2 people. The largest number was 58, actually held by a person with a Muslim name. So what's interesting here is compared to the 1798 data, about 65, 64% were in these small households. And there were clearly these very large things, which I think were probably on the prazus for defense, for trading, for agriculture. When you get them to being libertos, I think it's over 80%. I think most of these are domestics. And one of the things I want to do is to go through the whole list eventually, see how many had one male or female, how many had 2, and how this broke down. Now I have to make this clear at the beginning. I'm not going to do this work. This is a teaser for some graduate student or a team of Mozambicans or somebody with a lot of sharp money or something like that from Canada. This is not my major calling in life, but it is a fascinating document, and you can see that how useful this kind of stuff is to begin to break these numbers down. Now, when you look at the owners, when you look at the owners, the masters, most of the names are Portuguese. And I call them Portuguese name masters because it doesn't tell you that they're Portuguese. I mean, my guess is that there are very few Portuguese, that there'll be some. And the only way to find this out is to go into all the documentation for the region and to go through all the government stuff. I mean, that's something I've never done. I've done some of that for the 18th century, but not for the 19th. But you got a number of what I call non-Portuguese name masters in this period. And 140 of them have Vanya names. Vanya were the trading caste that I've written about some, but Pedro Machado is the key person who's written about this. In the late 18th century his dissertation goes to 1840, so it's a little before this. But they were the main ivory traders. And so it's not surprising to find them, not just at Mozambique, but also up in this area. What is interesting is that they don't appear, no non-Portuguese, non-Muslims appear in the 1798 registry. Although there is one point at which he says, refers to some non-Portuguese as gentios. But in the Estado de India, east of the Cape, gentoo usually meant Hindu. So I'm not quite sure how it was being used then. But there are Vanyas, there are a number of Muslim Gujarati names. There are other Indians, which are sort of like people whose names I couldn't read yet. And then there's about 9 Swahili, including a woman named Fatima. And the only way, and this is again completely arbitrary, and because I'm just beginning it, I'm not claiming a lot here, the way I distinguish between a Muslim Gujarati and a Swahili is that some names are just will have Hassan Qasim. Other names would say Juma Bono for bin, something. So if it's got a bin, it's got an ibn in it, I put it in the Swahili category. It's pretty clear that's what it is. And Gujarati names generally don't use that. But that's something that has to be investigated more thoroughly. Now, what can we tell about some of these names and how this gets to some of the things we've talked about. So when you start looking at where people come up, I mentioned eventually I think it would be really interesting to see, do Muslim masters have Muslim liberatus? I think in the end there probably is a good deal of mixing. And then what about Vanyas who are Hindus? They're either Jains or Hindus. And what I've just, glancing at it, it looks as though they're pretty mixed, but you do see some interesting names. So here you can see in this list, which is just a blow-up of the 2 pages I showed you, Claudina, Felicia, the Emma, Regina. But here's a name, Mosimbo. Well, if you go back to the map, Mosimbo is right near where Mosimbo Praia is, which is actually a fairly large town in northern Mozambique. And so there are names like this, and there are other names like. So there's some of the names that are given are place names. Other names are, so I guess that's, other names that show up are clearly slave names. So Sagwat is gift in Portuguese, and that's clearly not somebody's name. It's been given to them by, so they presumably you can tell they were a slave. The other thing is that it's in this other one, and this is somebody who's the master is a Vanya. Here's somebody whose name is Mabruk, classic slave name. Baraka, blessing, Mabruk, blessed. This is one of the kind of standard, this is not a name that a good Muslim would get. This is a name you give to a slave. I remember the first time I ever really became aware of that, for those of you who are international football fans, not the stuff they play in this country. You remember that the fullback for France was named Marius Trésor. And I thought, well, there is a slave. Trésor is just that kind of. So there are names like this that you can pick out. And then there are other names that are clearly African. They're place names. There are some where people are called Mukazambo, which actually means head slave. It's a term that shows up in Zambezia. But what's interesting in this is that 2 of the people named Mukazambo are the only liberto of a master. So either maybe they were a Mukazambo previously, or it's just a name you gave. So there's a lot of interesting stuff that can be kind of teased out in names, but I think the only way this will happen is by reading the whole corpus of material. The other thing is a big question, and this is why I had Annie read everything I do. She said, how do they collect this stuff? We have no idea. So a law is promulgated, you have to register your slaves. So what's clearly happened, and we know this, is that some were just let go. And I think in general, part of the demographic profile is that people who are probably too old, or they just, not going to bother registering you, you're on your own. And they probably just hung around in some way. So that most of the people who are registered are young, and means you can work them for another, at least till 1878 eventually. And the, most of these, I just lost my train of thought on that one. But you'll find that, that we don't know, did people come into to Igbo to register their libertos? Or did somebody go out household to household or wherever and register them? And then, how are these people named? I mean, it's not hard to figure out how the masters were named. How are they named? We don't know. Did the Signor say, these are my libertos and these are their names? In some cases where there's, 25 or something, I can't imagine that they kept a little hand list and were checking it. But so there's a really interesting process, and it gets back to all the same questions we've been having about this, right? About 3 or 4 minutes at the most, yeah. And so I think the only way to get it, and we have no idea how the instructions are actually, what the clerks were said. The other thing is there are about 7 or 8 different names. Not names, there are 7 or 8 different hands over a period of time. So it's not like Henry's delicious case where he actually knows for a period of time who the clerk was. So it's not at all clear how this was done. And I think what I see this document doing, it's obviously, I think it probably should be completely analyzed, digitized. It would be a terrific document to get up. It would fit into a larger than Atlantic kind of a database. And there certainly must be stuff like this from Angola. Yeah, so that would
there's
also
one from
be
Cape Verde also.
because this is really about colonial slavery.
Yeah.
And the transition to freedom, and then in the Portuguese case, the transition to forced labor. And all of it, everybody being sent to Sao Tome, to work in cocoa, all that thing. But it's also, I think, a real way of getting at the social history of this region, which was still being, there was significant slave trading going on across the Mozambique Channel. Also, this is an area where the French were constantly trying, and had, for some extent, free labor and so-called free immigration to Nushi Bay, to Mayotte, to Reunion. And the only way to do this is going to be basically to read through absolutely everything for Cape Delgado. This is, as I said, a good dissertation or something, or a collective product. And the document itself really, I think, having been working with it in as long bursts as I could take, with a bright light and a magnifying glass thing, is going to take a lot of work to tease all of this stuff out, just to get the names. Bentu actually has gone through this, the 1798 one, and has a list of all of the Portuguese names. It's very Portuguese, actually, kind of production, listing everything. But I think that would be important to do here, because essentially the Cape Delgado Islands, Grima Islands, are an extension of Swahili society. So the fact that it's cosmopolitan, that it's multilingual, that it's mostly Muslim, is not surprising. The problem is that we don't really know any of the details, and this document, I think, is a wonderful way to kind of work out and to look at a period which is quite complicated in the history of Northern Mozambique. But it gives us a baseline that's really good. And maybe if somebody does this work, they'll find it's not listed in the Registry of 19th century documents in Mozambique, but maybe the Registry of Slaves, which should have taken place about 10 years before, maybe somebody will find that. So with that, I leave you. Thank you.
So next, we'll hear from Andrew Pearson, who works both within and beyond the Academy. And maybe this reveals something about my own archaeology envy, to disclose my fascination with the notion that he gets paid by someone other than the university to do the thinking and work and production that we do only in the university context. So in addition to public and contract archaeology, Andrew is currently a research associate at Bristol University, where he's studying liberated African establishment on St Helena. The research is undertaken in the Department of Archaeology and Anthropology, and it follows on from the Liberated Fellowship that he had, which supported the beginning of this work. With that, turn it over to him.
Thank you very much. And if I could just begin with my thanks to Alex for both the organisation and the invitation. I think being based in Wales and working in the South Atlantic, there's a certain amount of kind of isolation to my work, so it's nice to actually come here, listen to other people, be able to present, so thank you very much. And perhaps in keeping with a lecture on medical treatment, I'd like to begin with a slight health warning to my own lecture, insofar as obviously everyone else really here is coming from a historical point of view, myself from archaeology, so there are images of basically African corpses, so just to be warned that when these flash up on the screen I have to kind of mention this in advance. I don't make an apology for that. I think the Rupert's Valley site is unique. It has a power to shock, and I think it's a power that I personally don't feel I feel happy to use, but nonetheless I think I do recognise the sensitivities that go with that. Okay, to begin then, in July 1848, St Helena's governor launched an investigation into the state of affairs in his Liberated African depot based in Rupert's Valley. And he did so because of the disastrous mortality that had prevailed there amongst the recaptives, which in that particular year had reached almost 1/3 of all arrivals. But his inquiry didn't relate to an anomalous period. Really, through the 1840s into points in the 1850s, that kind of figure had been seen time and again. The letters of his medical officers convey the same sort of element of despair. Everything had been tried, they said, but all to no avail. In absolute numbers, this amounts to approximately 8,000 people died in the depot, and that's human wreckage which was disposed of in essentially communal graveyards, or in smaller numbers, just rowed out to sea and dumped. And yet, far from being a fatal place, Governor Ross presided over an island that for centuries had gained a reputation not for being a fatal place, but for its salubrity, for being a place that saved particularly sailors calling on the way back from the East Indies. So in this lecture I want to examine one aspect, so that's the medical treatment that was afforded to St Helena's liberated Africans. But in so doing I hope also to illustrate some elements of their life stories, of their death stories if you will, and also the interaction that you can make between history and archaeology to bring these kind of things to light. St Helena, very briefly, as you see from the map, or you did see from the map before I moved it, there we go, lies in the mid-Atlantic between Africa and Brazil. It's one of the very last vestiges now of the British Empire. Discovered in 1502, it's really been in British possession since the 1650s. Best known as Napoleon's place of exile between 1815 and 1821, a place so remote that it afforded no possibility of escape. But that association really disguises a far longer and more significant contribution to world history, insofar as in Britain's empire building, it's a vital way station between Europe and the East. And to be honest, in some ways, had Britain lost it during the Dutch invasion in 1670, one wonders really how it could have developed its Indian Ocean, particularly its empire in India. I mean, St Helena is underestimated, but arguably it's that important. It also plays an important, and again perhaps understated role in abolition, stemming really from the slave trade Portugal Bill of 1830.